All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so happy to be here with all of you. Apologies for the time confusion. If you were here promptly at 7, I'm on autopilot and think we always start at 7:30. So we are beginning it a little bit later than we said we would at 7 p.m. But we appreciate your grace. We're so excited to celebrate The Future is Collective, effective workplace strategies for building a culture of care. We are here with the author, Niloufar Khonsari. We are also here with a wonderful conversation partner, Eveline Shen. And I'm going to introduce, you go by Ev, right? You prefer
Yes.
Ev? Great. So Ev is an award-winning leader and social change strategist who has spent over 2 decades empowering others to lead with courage and authenticity. As a seasoned executive director, she helped to build and grow the national reproductive justice movement. Now, through her work at Leading Courageously, she teaches the Courageous Operating System. This framework helps leaders stay true to their values, transform adversity into strength, and exponentially increase their impact. She has a brand new book out, Choosing to Lead Against the Current, which is also available from Charis, and it offers a bold blueprint for change makers committed to building a just and liberated future. So welcome, Ev. Thanks for being with us. And
Great to be
Niloufar,
here.
Niloufar Khonsari is a longtime Bay Area organizer, facilitator, and movement lawyer who supports communities and organizations to build more just, caring, and participatory ways of working together. They are the co-founder of Pangea Legal Services, a worker-led immigrant justice organization, and now work through Bala Rising to support groups with organizational development, capacity building, and practicing collective leadership. Their work is rooted in lived experience, shaped by their journey across borders, years of legal advocacy, and an ongoing practice of listening to and learning from community. So, welcome, Nila. We're so glad you're here. I saw this book in our catalog and was just really excited to learn more about your work and all that you are doing. So I'm going to get out of the way so we can get right into it. I do want to let folks know that they'll be able to ask questions. So if you have a question, you can drop it in the chat at any time, and I'll put it into the Q&A spot so that Ev can engage with it. But yeah, let's get right into it. Welcome to you both. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you so much. So we are super excited that there's so many of you here, and we want to make this kind of a conversation. And so if you can put in the chat where you are from so we get a sense who's in the room, that would be amazing. Thank you. And then also just want to invite folks because we know that you all also bring a lot of experience and wisdom and want that to come into play too. So please feel free to engage as actively. So just want to welcome folks again to this conversation about the future is collective, effective workplace strategies for building a culture of care. So can we just take a moment to take in that phrase, a culture of care, and what that means during this political moment when so much of the opposite is happening? So much harm and violence to our communities, families, our neighbors. And so this is really a wonderful way to connect to a vision of what we want. Nilo and I share the same publisher, and they got us together to do this event with Charis Books. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, Nilu, but also to be doing this with Charis Books. It's really awesome. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you today and talking, in addition with another woman of color, a person of color author that is really bringing kind of a analysis that I think is about what restructuring kind of how we think about how we want to govern and how we want to operate. So we will be in conversation for about 35 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So let's start. Nilu, what is the Futures Collective about, and who is it for?
Thanks, Ev. Yeah, what's it about? I mean, you touched on, the times that we're living in, and a time when there's so much harm and so many systems and things that are not working for us, uh, and that are kind of getting transmitted also into organizations and into our movements. There's so much that's just not going well, and moving in the way that we want, and that's aligned with a lot of our values. And there is it's a time where there's a lot less insight and focus on what we do want, or there I mean many of us do have that, and that's really what the future is collective is about. It's about practices, stories, and real organizational examples, movement examples of systems and structures and cultures that are working well, and it focuses on the how and why they're working effectively. Um, it's a book of not just the stories or examples, but also a lot of tools. They're in the appendix. There are about 50 pages of tools and resources that folks can use and adapt. And there's a through line in the book of my own experience as a leader and as a co-founder of the immigrant justice organization, Pangea Legal Services, and an organization that I led for a little over 10 years, and where I was a lawyer in addition to being the founding ED. And then moved into a co-executive director structure, and then 21 co-directors by the time I transitioned. Um, and the examples that I draw on are from Pangea are because it was a very high functioning or highly effective organization. Every consultant and partners that we worked with, they would come and they would work with us, and they would, every time we would hear, oh my gosh, this is such a high functioning organization or highly effective organization. And so I wrote it for, and it was a very much a collective process of the writing process. I had over 5 editors. There were 4 revisions, 4 years of writing. There are over 100 people thanked, and in the acknowledgments, there's a lot of collective energy and wisdom that went into this book. Um, and it's for workers, for students, um, for leaders, people in middle management, anyone who's in social justice spaces, movement spaces, especially to start. Um, and and I Yeah, I see it being applicable to to anyone really who wants to do things differently, who just doesn't want to keep doing the status quo of like these strict hierarchical, modeled after corporate structures systems that we operate under.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I wanted, for me, the seeds of my book started long before I knew I was even going to write a book. And growing up, uh, my experience growing up as one of the few Asian Americans in a small town in Colorado, where the land was beautiful, but the people were sometimes not so welcoming, deeply informed my sense of who could become a leader and who wasn't supposed to be a leader. So in your book, you start with an introduction of yourself as a child of the revolution. So could you share more about kind of what inspired you to explore the principle or idea of collective leadership in general?
Yeah, I do start with my own story in the beginning, and it's a story of I was born in Iran, and under a great deal of imperialism, U.S. imperialism, British imperialism, um, that influenced the politics and culture of the situation that I was in, and the displacement of myself, my family, many members of my community and family who were displaced as a result of government overthrow, war, U.S. backed war, and systems that that don't work and that I reject, and many of us reject, and and so what really resonated for me and changed my worldview in a significant way was when I studied abroad in college. It was the first time that I saw collective and leadership modeled well and in a humane and kind and caring way that that wasn't replicating or just slightly modifying these other unjust systems. And I studied abroad in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and that was back in 2004. And Argentina had just gone through a massive economic crisis, and the people, tens of thousands of workers, maybe even hundreds of thousands of workers, began began organizing, and they had been organizing. There were general assemblies and a lot of organizing leading up to the crisis, but after the crisis, there was this incredible worker-led movement of restarting these factories that had been left abandoned by foreign owners who left Argentina after the crisis started and the currency devalued. And these workers just, came to these factories, smashed open the chains that locked them up, and retook these workplaces. There were, clothing manufacturers, ice cream, glass, all kinds of different businesses, and the workers came back to these factories in Greater Buenos Aires in Argentina, and restarted not just restarted the factories, but also restarted them in a cooperative structure, like as worker co-ops. And they when I visited, I visited a garment factory once with a worker that I was introduced to through a professor and at the University of Buenos Aires. And we walked into the factory, and he showed me the building and where folks were having a meeting that day. They were sitting in a circle and discussing. And he described to me, they rotate leadership in different ways. Salaries are distributed based on people's needs. One of the coworkers has a sick mother. One of the coworkers has multiple children. They get paid more than some of the single individuals that don't have dependents or people to care for. And there were just nuances and details in the way that they co-led and held power in this organization and in these worker co-ops. And so I ended up writing my college thesis on worker co-ops and these worker co-ops and worker-led organizations in Argentina. And when I set out to start up my own nonprofit organization, Pangea Legal Services, I had these worker cooperatives and this collective leadership and distributed power in mind.
That's incredible. I love that story and just the seeds that experience planted, in you. And I think that it's, yeah, I wonder, well, we could talk more about like what different ways of providing kind of this collective care through structure looks like. But the idea that you could base a salary based on what people need, that's awesome.
It's awesome and very challenging in practice.
Yeah.
Very challenging. Yeah.
Yes, totally agree. Well, let's talk about this culture of care because it's a running theme. It's in your title. What does that mean in practice, and how do we get there?
Yeah. In this moment, well, throughout my experience with in movements and social justice movements, starting back in college in the early 2000s, all the way to now, what I see people get burned out on the most is not just the hard work and the exhaustion from the external conditions, but also the the fact of not having a say inside the organizations that hold us, the political home or the social justice space that we're working in, or the values aligned workplace that we're in. So not having a say or not being heard, and and conflicts, conflicts that are not handled skillfully or with the resources that we need. And a lot of the burnout kind of culminates, or ends up there. And so even when we have intentions, like I did, with to care, to set up an organization that has these values and the system of collective leadership, like the Argentinian worker co-ops or the recuperated factories. Even when we have that intention, which I did very much from the start, the it's not enough to that's not enough. The intention's not enough. Talking about is not enough. Even putting your money there is not enough. It kind of has to go beyond like a few acts or the words. And one of the things I do talk about in the book is we need to create structures for our cultures, and in order for folks to really feel seen and heard and understood and included, the structures also need to be there to support that the intention. And I mentioned I had that intention from the start, and I had I did a lot of things, this from my own experience. I did a lot of things, or a few things from the start. The one was everyone was paid equally at Pangea while I was there from day one when I started, which the initial salary for us was $40,000 a year, which was below living wage in San Francisco. And by the time I transitioned, we were 21 full-time employees. All of us paid the same salary at $80,000 a year. And the equal pay was a significant thing. Was one thing. Then the intention around communication. I shared a lot with staff when things were happening. Our budget was completely transparent. The biggest piece was the salaries. But even then, after a few years, I started getting feedback from colleagues that I wasn't sharing power very well, and that some folks were not feeling heard or understood. And like a lot of us, especially in leadership positions, I was moving fast. There's a lot of projects, a lot of ideas, a lot of leaders, especially, we're visionary. We want to start projects. We want to do things. And the feedback that I got was, we feel like there are a couple of people or a few people at Pangea, including you, Nilu, that kind of make all these decisions, and then we're just told at the end. And that, at the time, I was, I didn't take it in, like, oh yes, of course, like, yes, let me hear you out on this. My defenses went up. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, we have equal salaries. Can you see what all these other organizations are doing? Like, I'm sharing and communicating, and we're far more collective and like absolutely non-hierarchical in comparison. And it was a very like yes and like both truths were true. We were quite developed or quite aligned with our values in many ways, and folks still weren't being heard. So the learning, or one learning in that, was the timing at which folks are included and invited to participate and make decisions. And the structures that we didn't have in place. We did not have, we had the culture and the intention. We didn't, of like participation, inclusion, collective. We did not have the structures. So we ended up hitting a little bit of a crisis point. Because of my actions and because of the lack of structures, and we had a retreat to help address that. And we talked out, the feelings and what had been surfacing for folks, how things, yeah, how we were kind of at a low point on morale, and in the way that we had been in this conflict, um, and um, and it had come from like my being quite directive and a little bit top down and on multiple things, with new stuff. And after that retreat, once we shared our, where folks were at, we we moved to doing some research. Okay, we we need to. Our wonderful facilitator at the time, Kieran Nigam, they recommended that we look at, developing an intentional shared leadership structure. And so from there, we went on to research what other organizations do. And we learned quite a lot. Two of my colleagues did the research and interviewed folks. They learned about how they interviewed some political organizations, like leftist political organizations. They interviewed nonprofit organizations. They brought back the information and what they learned and some of the data, and we talked about it. From there, we had three more days of retreat time, where we collectively looked at the areas of work and distributing and decentralizing authority in major decision areas of our organization. Three of the major ones, the biggest ones across most organizations, are hiring, firing, and budget. So those, we looked at, what are the power heavy and what are the, other areas that folks are impacted by. And we created what we ended up calling hubs. There are like leadership committees, and multiple people, at least 2 people were on each hub, up to 4 or 5 were on each hub. And we created 8 different hubs. And from there, the structure and the practice and the timing of which people can be heard shifted and evolved. It was, yeah, to go back to your question, it was how do we do culture of care? Was that the question?
Yeah. How do you do it? And then what does that look like in practice and how do you get there?
Yeah. Okay. So that's one example of what it looks like in practice. There are many others, and I as part of in the process of writing this book, I reflect a lot and I give the most details about my own experience. But I draw on many other dozens of interviews of highly effective, also collectively led organizations across the U.S. I also reference research from international organizations, groups that are like as small as 2 all the way to 3,000 staff that do collective leadership. And the bottom line of how do we get to a culture of care? We need both. We need like both the practices and the cultural, the values alignment, the clarity in that, and backed with some real structures and design that's intentional.
Yeah, I think, Neela, what you're really kind of illustrating for us is that it's like you said at the beginning, you can have the intention of wanting to have a flatter, non-hierarchical structure. You can have the values, but actually making it happen is a lot of there's a lot that needs to be put in place in terms of the infrastructure, the practices, the ways that you embody the values, and it can't just be in one area. It has to be in all areas. So it's a very proactive practice, right? It's a very proactive engagement that needs to happen. And I think sometimes people think about, oh, it's a flat structure. There's no, you don't need to worry about very much infrastructure. You just kind of talk about things until you agree. But that's not how it works. And so on the flip side, because there's so much intention and so much effort and so much care that needs to go into these systems, how do you answer when people say, well, doesn't that just take too much time? Like, we have to do work. So how are you able to do the work as creating this beautiful structure?
Yeah. I recently heard a quote. I was watching a documentary. I can't remember what it was, but I recently heard this quote of, you can either do things by design or disaster. And and the design piece, intentionally, I have clients now that are very much, designing intentionally with before they have conflict, before they have a crisis moment, designing some structures for decision making and some kind of modified consensus based decision making and creating decision making processes for things that are more urgent and that have to get done. um, they're kind of getting ahead of things, and that's the hope and intention with this book and with for many organizations. I'm also part of, have been in the last few years part of a couple of cohorts of over like 90 organizations across the US where folks are intentionally designing collective structures and systems. And that's a choice. And it's a significant amount of time. Yes, one of my friends and colleagues, consultants at Pangea, told us once that you need to dedicate 30% of your time to governance, of your organizational like work time. So, and the question then is like, how do we do that? Especially in a moment where there's just constant crises. There's no space. We're already at 200% maxed out. Like, where do we find the other 30% to dedicate to our internal work and our internal governance? And the answer, the disaster, the crisis moments, we hit a little bit of a crisis moment at when I was in my former organization. And most organizations, I think, get to intentional design as a result of some crisis, if they don't fold or fall apart altogether. But the wisdom, and there's a lot of wisdom that comes in this book from BIPOC, queer, leaders of color. Adrienne Maree Brown is one of them. She says you have to move at the speed of trust. And the speed of trust can sometimes, I know, it can sometimes feel very inefficient. And things do, like you said, things do still need to get done. And there's a reality of external pressures. But it's there's a short-termness to this inefficiency thinking. Like in the short term, we might, if we ignore the internal work and the 30% that we might want to give to our internal governance and our care work, then we might get a lot of other things done. But in the long run, giving that time up front actually creates a huge efficiency in retention, people not leaving because they're burnt out, in people being engaged, not checking out because they're like, oh, I tried to give my input, it didn't get, it wasn't taken, and it was ignored, or so they didn't have time for it. I'm just going to check out. I'm just going to do the bare minimum. There's an efficiency in people like then actually staying engaged because they own and they're full participants. Organizations thrive as a result of putting in that time and that intention. And the mission, the purpose of the org and the movement or the group that you're in stays strong and thrives too. So it's a hard one, and I think that the inefficiency argument is not. It needs to be taken and from a little bit more of a zoomed out perspective to be valued.
Yeah, I think because, when people think about crises or disasters, it's also very short term. But when you think about over the long term of an organization, what is going to actually be more efficient because you're able to avoid those disasters like you're talking about is something that I think would be very wise for people to think about. And so I wanted to, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Since you're saying you can avoid, yes, definitely avoid some of the big crisis moments, and by practicing governance proactively before you get to a crisis moment, you build that muscle to manage and move through challenges more effectively when they do come, because everyone, even when you do have structures and cultures that are wonderful, that are effective and strong, like
Mhm.
at my former organization, the you're still going to have conflicts, you're still going to have struggles, but the muscle of like moving through that is stronger, and you just come out of it and more more united and rather than divided.
Yeah, because you have an ongoing practice of it. Right.
Yeah.
That's great. Do you have examples of that like either in your organization or other organizations that you know of or in the book
Examples of
of
what?
when there was like of developing this practice, and then when there was a crisis it just allowed people to be in a much better place?
Yeah, there was we did in the last years that I was at Pangean, that in organizations I see now, that I support and offer this kind of like training and workshops around, come around giving effective feedback. And another wonderful consultant and coach, Sheena Wadawan, offered me and my former organization the first feedback training that we had, and it was effective. Essentially, like liberatory communication, how to keep these channels of communication clear in a collective, so that um, so that you can address them more effectively down the line. So um, there there was I can't think of a specific example that where well, yes, actually there was an example of um, uh, feedback that I received as a result of like some of these structures that we had and the feedback training and communications training that we had, that from a colleague that I had, that she had felt dismissed after I said something, after I had kind of negated her request to join one of the hubs and support in one of the hubs. And because of the internal work that we had done as an organization and some of the internal work that I had done, as a result of this, some of our crisis moment, I was able to receive that and respond by without being defensive, like I had been before,
Mhm.
um, and I was able to actually make space for her and and course correct, instead of further shutting her out and making her feel even more unheard. And so that was like it was a small pain point, a small communication piece, and like hierarchy that came into play, that or where a colleague moved into their power and gave, the former executive director and founder, co-founder of this organization, feedback, and it was leveled, and we were able to move, build that muscle of like collective and collaborative work. And I did end up, course correcting and inviting her into the hub and supporting um, supporting her development as a result of that.
I I love that example because one, it answers the question about like what does it mean when we practice something that then it actually results in us being able to deal with things much more easily. But it also, I think, underlying that points to this growth that we need to do as leaders in our own personal development. And I really believe that that we that is one of the most critical things to be an effective leader, is to continuously kind of do an assessment of where we need to grow and what we can, how we want to to evolve and to do it in a proactive way. And I think that example just brings that up, that it's the structure put into place and made it more accessible for that person to be able to step into their power, but then you changed since that one incident when there was a crisis, and you also grew and developed. So I think that's a really beautiful example. Thanks for sharing. Okay, so if folks are in a position where they're not in a very flat structure, kind of, do you have some words of guidance in terms of how they can begin to influence, if that's what they want to do, or kind of how do they begin to empower themselves to start to help an organization or coalition shift in that way?
Yeah, I hope that this book, The Futures Collective, can be a resource for folks at any level of positional power in their organization. Um, because there are so many resources, I think I mentioned there are like over 50 pages of tools and resources, and they can be pulled. I mean, there can be bite-sized pieces that are taken from these values and from these principles, um, and examples at other places to be woven into what makes sense in each organization, and or in a new workplace, a different workplace. Um, I think that the like examples and the stories that come with the tools like give it like the texture and like realness, and then the range of like organizations and types of groups that do this work also give it like more texture. And I think it can apply to folks at any level in the organization. I do think that um, yeah, I mean, the invitation is to for folks to take what makes sense for you in this moment and leave the rest. There is no one size fits all whatsoever in this. And some of my reviews are like, "Oh, this is a blueprint." It's more like a sample to be adapted, and and lots of samples and lots of examples and templates to be adapted and changed, because no one group is the same, or is significantly can do the same thing or needs the same things. But yeah, so my hope is that there's something in there for everyone, regardless of the level or position in the organization that you're in.
That's great. So I wanted to kind of, because the things that you are what needs to happen in a structure where in a non-hierarchical structure, sometimes and most often goes directly contradictory or against kind of societal ways of operating, societal values. So in the book you even talk about salaries, like you're hiring lawyers who are used to a certain level of salary. So can you talk about kind of some of the work that you did, or that your staff did, to help people, like to recruit lawyers, right? Or to understand how to work with, you have a section on working with funders. Like how did you deal with that rub that happens between kind of what the status quo of how society does things, and then what you were trying to do, which again was they're not in alignment and often contradictory, in opposition of each other.
Yeah, one of the things that we did was early on was develop a set of values. We called them points of unity that were woven into our language and our recruiting, into our salaries, like any policy or anything that we developed in writing or that we promoted externally. Those points of unity were a driver. So we would always draw one of our points of unity or two of them and put them at the top of any proposal or any action that we took. And so, in recruiting early on, there were multiple, at least, I believe during my time, there were at least 3 staff that we recruited at Pangea that took pay cuts to be at this organization because they were so strongly committed to the values and the clarity in them, and the way that we led, and that we co-created and co-led the work and the organization. And so people were drawn to that. And some staff took like significant, like $50,000 cuts, $20,000 cuts in salary to come work at this organization. And it was very values driven. The organization also had the highest retention rate for the longest time. Now, those were talking points that I would share with funders. How effective it is, and how we recruit really such aligned, like strong leaders and folks into this space, and have create this healthy culture, and a place that folks want to be at and stay.
Thanks for sharing that. So I wanted to open it up for people to ask Nilu questions. For those of you who've had the chance to read the book, or those of you who are, just getting acquainted to the book, please buy the book. But also, just if you have questions for them, we'd love to have your voice in this and be in conversation. And I know folks, I'm gonna, as people think about their questions and type them in, I have another question for you. Mm-hmm. So, what does a collective future look like? Because I think that in these times, there's so much that's happening that we don't want, that we are resisting, that we are fighting against. But what do we want to fight for, right? What do we want to build? So help us imagine, or not imagine, but based on what's happening, like what does a collective future look like?
I'm glad you said based on what's already happening, because I mean, the train is moving. There are many organizations, many groups that are already moving in this direction. And, we're calling it all these different names: collective, cooperative, or, shared leadership, culture of care, equity, belonging, inclusion, all of these words. And they're all part of, we're all moving in this direction of creating spaces where people are heard and people feel seen and understood. And my vision and hope, my dream for 20 years from now is that we are really good and really effective at making folks feel understood and felt and heard. And that these practices and structures, some of which, I mentioned in the book, and that many of which a lot of groups are practicing, that they will become the norm rather than the exception. And that we'll just, anytime we start a new group, in a social justice setting, in a movement setting, we're starting a new organization or group, we run through our checklist, basics. Like, we don't have to first deconstruct and take apart our egos and all this stuff, and then reconstruct. But like, we just go in and we're like, okay, how do we make decisions? Who gets to say what, when, and who participates in this? What about when there's a time sensitive decision? Like, these are our norms. This is our structure, kind of immediate. And we're just fluent at it. That's the vision. And I envision that this is going to start in the social justice and the nonprofit movement sectors, first and translate into other spaces as we move to other jobs and to other roles in our professional careers. Some of us might end up in local office, and or on this our kids, like school PTA, or the or board of supervisors, various positions, that we take these practices and expand them into our local governments, and eventually state, and eventually broader scales than that.
Hmm.
And that's where there's this evolution that's really sustainable, sustained, continuous, that then supports a bigger change, of revolution that stays.
Hmm. Thank you. What words of guidance would you give to someone who, you were saying, I wish, when people they want to start something, how do they, if they've never thought about this before? I mean, I know your book has a lot of tools and models. So, but and aside from reading your book, like how would you, or and you coach people. So how do you help people begin to think about this, to put this into practice? That is not an easy thing, as we talked about in the beginning. There's a lot of complexity. What kind of support, and what would you, yeah, how do you help them start?
Um, I mean, first of all, I think people can start with their resources that they have. Like, you don't need to hire a coach or consultant. Yes, that is very useful. It was very useful to me and our team. We had a consultant from the first year, really, or the second year, all the way to the end. Um, and we added, more and more, as we could. It was a wise investment, I think. But you don't have to, depending on budgets. Um, and well, the book is one, but then there are wonderful resources and articles. Nonprofit Quarterly publishes uh, really incredible work, and hosts webinars. There are a lot of other resources out there that are available, low cost and free. Then there's also, as a starting point, I mentioned Pangea's points of unity, or values. I think that that's a really solid start for any organization, to not just write out 10 words or 8 words that are your values for the organization, but to really define them, and to use that as sort of an internal constitution, um, for for your work going forward, and to reference it as if it is a constitution. This policy is guided by this point of unity and value. So you stay strong. And a lot of organizations, I'm hearing questions recently about, or in the last years, about how do we stay connected and do this when we're remote, or when some of us are in one city or country and others are in another. Points of unity, a set of values, this kind of constitution that grounds you and us, is, I would say, is the number one starting point.
Hmm. Great. And you have that outlined in your book, right? I don't remember the exact
Yeah,
page you refer
yeah,
people to, but they can find it in the book. That's awesome.
yeah.
Okay. Well, if there are any questions that are coming up, and maybe I'll hand it back to Charis. But I want to say, first of all, thank you, Nilu, for your leadership, and the way that you're kind of bringing these core values to Pangea, but also now you're like helping other people do the same. And the book is, I know what it takes to write a book, and it's, I don't know, maybe it was easy for you, but for me it was quite a thing. But just thank you for putting it down, all the wisdom and collecting the models from other organizations so that people can have it, in this one book, and they can, see and mine the resource for all different kinds of ways, from boards to working with funders to dealing with conflict. I think that there's a lot policy, there's a lot of things that the ways that you can uh, help people get into the details of how to make this work. So thank you so much. It was been a pleasure, and yeah, and I wish I think everyone here's the book, buy it from Charis, support Charis, and I'll hand it back to you all.
Well, thank you so much. You've done my job for me beautifully. So yeah, my job is just to say you can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy The Futurist Collective from Charis. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. I also just dropped the link to Ev's book in the chat, so you can click that as well. And to say thank you again, I'm really inspired by everything that you said tonight, and really excited to maybe get some copies of the book and have a little book club with our staff. I think that this would be a great thing to do with collectives and people who are trying to think about alternative models. Have everybody read it and discuss it. Certainly boards, and so I hope people will be inspired to bring the book into their various environments, because I think you're doing a lot of really exciting thinking. So thank you to you both. I hope you both stay safe and well. And if you are ever in the Atlanta area, we'd love to see you in person.
Definitely.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. And also, I just want to give a second plug for Ev's book. It's called Choosing to Lead Against the Current. And I just got my copy, and it's really excellent, and lots of really wonderful tools and resources in there as well. Thank you for that. And thank you for being here with me, Ev. And
it's been a joy.
Thank you all so much.
Yes.